We're delighted to have Secretary of Perry with us. Very briefly, many of you know his background. His education is in mathematics with a PhD from Penn State University. As an entrepreneur in many, many areas, he was a founder of the ESL Corporation. He was also president of that from 1964 until 1977, when he became a part of the Carter administration, serving as Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering during that 4-year period. He was responsible in that position for all weapon systems procurement and for research and development. He served as a special advisor to the Secretary of Defense for Technology, Communications, Intelligence, and Atomic Energy. In the following years, he served on numerous corporations of major U.S. firms. He served on U.S. advisory committees, both the Senate and presidential committees. He was a trustee of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. All of his expertise during that area, as you know, not all of it, but certainly the expertise which is most appropriate to this event, centered about the areas of intelligence and technology, science, communications, and arms control policy. But of course, we have great interest in him today because he is the Secretary of Defense at an extraordinary time in American history, when very slowly we're beginning to articulate and establish a consensus, a new consensus, on American foreign policy and national security policy. Certainly actions will shape that new consensus as much as words, it appears. And very few Americans are respected both as an articulator of the current administration's policy, but also as a formulator of actions as the current secretary. So it's a great honor and also exciting to present to you the current Secretary of Defense, the Honorable William J. Perry.
I'm just delighted to be here in Baltimore, back in Baltimore, and an opportunity to meet some of friends that I've known for years in this wonderful city. And I apologize ahead of time that my stay here is so short. I had originally planned to have more time, that I could have had some fulsome discussions with you, but I got bottled in by a Senate hearing this morning on one end of me and a commitment in Washington at the other end. So this is going to be, I'm afraid, a cameo appearance. Life is about choices. The playwright Arthur Miller once wrote, "Where choice begins, paradise ends, innocence ends. For what is paradise but the absence of the need of choice?" You as individuals make choices every day, and you will live with the consequences of those choices, for good, for bad. Nations, of course, also make choices. Those choices are not as easily altered as those made by individuals, and the consequences are often far greater, the prices far higher. Today, America faces distinct and very difficult choices regarding its policy in Bosnia, a place where paradise and innocence ended long ago. These choices are being actively debated in Washington, but much of the debate on policy alternatives is taking place without an informed consideration of the consequences of these alternatives. The choice of a particular policy alternative leads us inexorably down a path, driven by an iron logic from consequence to consequence. And a major part of my job is to consider and to prepare for the defense consequences of the choices we make among alternative security policies. And today I would like to discuss these with you. Bosnia may well be the toughest security policy choice we have to make. Under Tito, it was said that Yugoslavia consisted of 7 neighbors, 6 republics, 5 nations, 4 languages, 3 religions, 2 alphabets, and 1 country. Even if Yugoslavia ever was 1 country, today it certainly is not. Over the past 4 years, Yugoslavia has completely disintegrated, and the collapse of Yugoslavia has left Bosnia as an independent state for the first time in its history. But Bosnia is not only a new state, it is a very unstable state because it included Muslims, Croats, and Serbs, 3 rival ethnic groups. Now, Bosnia's tradition of pluralism was shattered when the Serbs, who were the dominant ethnic group in Yugoslavia, found themselves as the minority ethnic group in the new state of Bosnia. The Serbs were a minority, but they were a heavily armed minority. So in 1992, the Serbs in Bosnia decided to take advantage of their military superiority and began making war on the Bosnian government and the Bosnian Muslims who controlled the government. This has been called a civil war, but it is also a war of aggression, since the Bosnian Serbs have been supported by their ethnic cousins in Serbia. I am not agnostic about who the victims are in this war. The Bosnian government and its supporters are the victims. The atrocities that are perpetrated by the Serbs, in particular ethnic cleansing, are abhorrent. Our government and the international community support the Bosnian government. We have formally recognized the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina as a sovereign nation. Serbia, on the other hand, is the subject of an international economic embargo and political censure for Serb actions in Bosnia. Currently, the Bosnian Serbs control about 70% of the territory in Bosnia. The so-called contact group, United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, have put a proposal on the table that preserves a unified state and gives the Serbs 49% of the land of Bosnia and leaves the Bosnian Muslims and Croats the other 51%. That proposal was rejected by the Serbs. In the meantime, a ceasefire has been accepted by the combatants, which will expire in about 6 weeks. The Bosnian government apparently is prepared to restart military operations this spring rather than accept the current unjust division of territory. The Serbs, on the other hand, apparently would rather see the war resume than give up the territory they presently control. Consequently, I do not see the prospect of a near-term political solution. Now, many people, while sympathizing with the Bosnian Muslims, find the situation too confusing, too complicating, and too frustrating. Some are even tempted to throw up their hands. They say Bosnia is a tragedy, but it is not our tragedy. They say we should wash our hands and simply walk away. This view is not only questionable from a moral standpoint, it is also flat out wrong from a national security standpoint. It is true that we do not have what I would call vital national security interests in Bosnia. That is to say, the survival of the United States is not threatened by actions in Bosnia. But we do have a security interest in preventing the violence from spreading and from stimulating a broader European war. We do have a security interest in limiting the violence and the flow of refugees, and we certainly have a humanitarian interest in mitigating the violence. So in my view, walking away is not an option. So what are the options? Stripped to the essence, we have essentially 2 choices. Choice A is to stick with our current policy, limiting the threat of the war and its impact on people while we are working for the peace. Choice B is to begin actively helping the Bosnian government achieve its political and its military goals. Under Choice A, we are working to limit the spread of the conflict beyond Bosnia's borders. And to that end, we have U.S. troops participating in a United Nations force in Macedonia. We are limiting the violence and the casualties by enforcing a no-fly zone over Bosnia and by enforcing zones around urban areas where heavy weapons are excluded. And we are mitigating the effects of the violence by airlifting food and medical supplies to civilian populations. And finally, we are participating in multinational diplomatic efforts to achieve a negotiated settlement. We have had significant success with the first three of these efforts. Before NATO began enforcing a no-fly zone, Bosnian cities were being indiscriminately bombed. Before we established a heavy weapons exclusion zone around Sarajevo, that city was subjected to intense artillery bombardments, sometimes up to 1,000 shells a day landing in the city. In Sarajevo alone, there were 10,000 civilian casualties that resulted from this bombardment. So our efforts have saved thousands of lives, and thousands more have been saved by the delivery of food and medicine. 14 nations are contributing over 12,000 UN troops to protect the enclaves, to deliver supplies, and to serve as buffers between the warring factions. 6 nations, including the United States, are participating in a NATO air operation that enforces the no-fly zone, the weapons exclusion zone, and which delivers humanitarian supplies. These efforts to mitigate the effects of the war have been very well executed and have been enormously beneficial. But we have not succeeded in the fourth goal, that is the goal of achieving a peace settlement. People find this frustrating. I find it frustrating. But many are further frustrated that our policies have not assisted the Bosnian people in their struggle to reverse the Serb gains and to punish those who participated in ethnic cleansing. These people support what I have called Choice B, taking active measures to help the Bosnian government achieve its political and military goals. My thesis to you today is that the active measures which have been proposed for that purpose send the United States headlong down a slippery slope. And at the bottom of that slope will be a humanitarian catastrophe, with a distinct possibility of a wider war breaking out and the drawing in of American combat troops. Now, nearly everyone in this debate accepts that sending American troops for ground combat in Bosnia is a non-starter. There is no support for this idea among the public or in the Congress. American casualties undoubtedly would be high, far higher than anyone could justify based on our national interests. So consequently, even critics of our present policy do not propose sending American ground troops to help the Bosnian government win the war. But ironically, many of these same people have other ideas on how to help Bosnia, which could very well lead to the same result. One suggestion, for example, is that America could conduct airstrikes to help the Bosnian military forces. But no responsible military commander believes we can change the outcome of the war with an air campaign alone. Bosnia is not Iraq. Bosnia is wooded, mountainous, and often cloud-covered. The Serbs spread out their weapons over a wide area and often place them in the middle of population centers. These factors combine to make it unlikely that air power by itself can be effective in changing the outcome of the war. Air power has been and can continue to be very effective in stopping the use of heavy weapons and bombers in the war. But if NATO or United States air power were to be used as close air support for the Bosnian army in an attempt to shift the military balance, our pilots would need the assistance of trained, ground-based forward air controllers to help coordinate their airstrikes. So we would have the prospect of captured pilots, of casualties on the ground among the controllers, and of very heavy civilian casualties, including casualties among the population we are trying to help. Another suggested way to help the Bosnian government cause, and of course which has been very popular with some members of the Congress, is for the United States to unilaterally lift the arms embargo which is now on the Bosnian government. The arms embargo went into effect in 1991, and it applies to all of the states of the former Yugoslavia. Its purpose, of course, is to limit the destructive power of all combatants in the region. However, because the Serbs inherited most of the weapons of Tito's Yugoslav armed forces, the embargo froze in place a military imbalance. The Bosnian government had no such inheritance and has been up against a much stronger Serb force with a significant advantage in tanks and other heavy weapons. Proponents of unilaterally lifting the embargo, as it applies to the Bosnian government, say they want at least to make it a fair fight. And that sounds like a compelling argument. This proposal has sometimes been called lift and leave. As proponents like it because they believe that this course is virtually risk-free for the United States, because it does not, they say, put American soldiers, sailors, and airmen in harm's way. Thus, this course appears to satisfy our urge to do something about Bosnia at little or no cost to America. These proponents also make the point that by leveling the battlefield, pressure will be brought on the Serbs to agree to a just peace. Well, such results are clearly desirable. But what is the likelihood that a unilateral lift, without further American involvement, would achieve those results? More critical observers of this course, instead of calling it lift and leave, call it lift and pray, because it is a dangerously flawed proposition. If one follows this course step by step to its logical conclusion, it also could lead to U.S. ground troops fighting in Bosnia, the very situation that the proponents say they are trying to avoid. Because simply authorizing U.S. manufacturers to sell arms to Bosnia will not by itself level the battlefield. To truly level the battlefield, to equalize the two warring forces, will take a major commitment to ensure that the arms reach Bosnia. And since the Bosnians do not have the financial resources, either the U.S. or a third party would have to supply the funds. Should the U.S. assume this responsibility, the financial costs are substantial, but that would be the least of our problems. We would also need to get the arms into the hands of the Bosnians. The Bosnians do not have a navy or an air force that could come and get the arms. We would have to deliver them to them. So we have to assume somehow that that delivery would take place. Now, sea and land delivery, if you simply look at the map of Bosnia, you see would require cooperation from a third party, in this case Croatia or Serbia, each of which has its own interests at stake and may very well not choose to cooperate. Whereas air delivery requires landing at airfields in Bosnia, all of which fall within range of Serb artillery. Realistically, then, we could expect American casualties even in the delivery of these supplies. And as we delivered them, we would be in the extremely awkward position of defying the other NATO nations who are enforcing the arms embargo against all the states of the former Yugoslavia. So American ships and American planes would have to evade and elude the ships and planes of our NATO allies, with whom we have worked these past 4 years in enforcing embargo. Well, let me assume that we could find a relatively safe way to deliver arms to the Bosnian government. We then have to deal with the question of training the Bosnian soldiers to use these weapons. Bosnians don't just need rifles or grenades, they need sophisticated arms to counter the Serbian advantage in heavy weapons. And using such arms takes training. We know from our own experience that it is not just the possession of arms, but training in their use that makes a force effective. So we would also have to consider using American soldiers to train the Bosnian forces. Now, assuming that we can solve the arms financing, delivery, and training questions, we now face a different set of tactical issues that evolve around this question. How would the Serbs react to the prospect of arms on their way to Bosnia? What if they launched preemptive strikes in an attempt to gain a military victory on the ground before the arms shipments arrived? In particular, what if the Serbs attacked the isolated UN-protected enclaves in Bosnia? This could result in tens of thousands of civilian casualties and hundreds of thousands of refugees. That's what I mean by humanitarian disaster. Now, if our decision to lift the embargo results in the Serbs overrunning these enclaves and massive civilian casualties, what do we do at that point? What is our responsibility at that point? We would face a difficult moral and political problem and an even more difficult military problem. From a moral and a political standpoint, there would be enormous pressure on us to retaliate in some way to stop this carnage. But militarily, that would not be easy. Airstrikes could punish the Serbs, but they could not by themselves defend the enclaves. They could not by themselves stop the killing. Indeed, they would only expand the violence. That brings us to yet another set of problems. Even if we resisted the pressure to do something and instead simply watched the enclaves being overrun, we would still have to deal with the inevitable evacuation of the UN peacekeeping forces. Key countries contributing peacekeepers have already firmly stated that they will not keep them in Bosnia if the United States lifts the embargo. That means that humanitarian relief will stop flowing, and we would have to decide whether to take over the protection of relief operations now being done by the UN or simply stand by and watch people starve. In addition, if it's decided that the UN forces have to evacuate Bosnia, we are committed in principle to participating in a NATO operation to help get them out, subject to the consultation with our Congress. And to do this operation properly, NATO and the United States would have to send in a substantial number of combat ground forces, the very situation we have been trying to avoid. Now, while it's possible that an evacuation of UN forces from Bosnia may become necessary no matter what we do, unilaterally lifting the embargo will make that evacuation a certainty, not just a possibility. In sum, unilateral lift could lead to a humanitarian disaster. It could lead to American ground troops in Bosnia, and it could lead to a wider war, or presumably it could lead to all three of those simultaneously. So if the arms embargo is to be lifted, it must be done in a multilateral way, because only by involving the international community generally on the side of the Bosnians can we avoid many, but not all, of the problems of unilateral lift. In short, unilateral lift is not an alternative to intervention with ground troops. It is merely another means of reaching that same result. It is an attempt to influence the war on the cheap. It is a policy that does not help the people of Bosnia and does not advance America's interests. in the Balkans. In addition, unilateral lift is detrimental to America's interests in a wider sphere. Without question, it would drive a wedge between the United States and the rest of the NATO alliance, a wedge deeper than any in NATO's history. Taken as a whole, these are disastrous and unacceptable consequences, which bring me back to what I called Choice A, continuing with our present policy, trying to contain the conflict, limiting the violence and its effects, and supporting negotiations to a peaceful settlement. We continue to seek ways to improve the implementation of the present policy. On the military side, we seek to improve the equipment capabilities and the organizational structure of the UN forces in Bosnia. On the diplomatic side, Vice President Gore and Croatia's President Tudjman announced on Sunday that Croatia would permit UN forces to remain there in a peacekeeping role. And this helps lessen the chance of a wider war. So while we can reasonably expect our current policy to continue to be successful in preventing the spread of the war, and to continue to be successful in limiting both the fighting and its effects, I confess to you that this policy gives me no great moral satisfaction, because it does not give America much leverage in influencing a peace settlement. Our approach to a peace settlement has been to facilitate the parties in reaching this settlement, recognizing that we do not have enough leverage to force a settlement. To force a peace on the combatants, we would have to be willing to fight a war, and that is an unacceptable level of commitment. Now, Bosnia is a tragedy which will end only when the parties themselves conclude that their interests are served better by a negotiated settlement than by continuing the war. And I understand that this may take some time, and that is why we are committed to those actions which lower the level of violence and mitigate the suffering while these peace talks continue. I am fully aware of the shortcomings of our present approach, but there are no good options in Bosnia. And we must be wary of the siren call coming from those who say that there are easy and painless ways for America to do something about Bosnia. There are many ways we can do something. None of them are easy. None of them are painless. Well, I began by talking about choices and consequences. Let me end by returning to this theme. Political life offers many opportunities for posturing, for pretending that there are simple solutions to complex problems. Bosnia as a policy issue is not difficult. It is painful, but it is not difficult. When you look carefully at the consequences, it is easy to make a choice between our two options. John Kenneth Galbraith once said, "Politics is not the art of the possible. Rather, it consists of choosing between the disastrous and the unpalatable." Our present course in Bosnia has been called unpalatable, but the alternative, unilaterally lifting the embargo, could prove to be disastrous. It is a course of action which might make us feel good today, but would result in the pointless spilling of American blood tomorrow. Well, I've shared with you today the consequences of alternative policy options in Bosnia. The truth is often unpalatable. It is nonetheless important to understand the truth. During the Second World War, Winston Churchill once said, "Men occasionally stumble over the truth, but most pick themselves up and hurry away without being affected by it." I have tried today to make you stumble over what I see as the truth in Bosnia, but I hope that you will be affected by it. Thank you very much.
The question is to ask you to comment on the participation of the Europeans in the Bosnian situation.
The UN force on the ground consists almost entirely of European nations. The United States is not participating in the UNPROFOR, the UN force in Bosnia and Croatia. Also, the NATO air operation, which I described to you, which does have U.S. participation, also has participation of the British and the French and the Dutch. So there is European participation in the operation, a greater participation than the United States. Also, Europe and the United States are participating in enforcing the embargo, which involves a substantial naval operation in the Adriatic. What no European nation has agreed to do is to enter the war decisively on the side of the Bosnian government. And I think the rationale for that is very much the same as the rationale that I have given you today.
The question to repeat for the television cameras is, what is the possibility of neighboring Muslim countries intervening in Bosnia?
There are some Muslim countries that already have forces in the UNPROFOR UN. They're a minority, but nevertheless a not insignificant part of the UNPROFOR forces. There are even more Muslim countries that have volunteered to put more peacekeeping battalions in Bosnia, and some Muslim countries who would like to enter the war on the side of the Bosnian government. Generally, I think my own judgment is that it would be a mistake to see this turned into a religious war. It is, as it stands now, it's a vicious and nasty political conflict, but it is not a religious war. So the United Nations is accepting the support of other Muslim countries, but it has kept that support in a minority. If, for whatever reason, the UNPROFOR, the UN, decides to leave Bosnia, to pull its forces out of Bosnia, it is quite possible that some, or maybe even all, of the Muslim countries that have forces there will decide to not only leave their forces there, but to reinforce them. And then it would become a Muslim war versus the Serbs. We have been trying to avoid that alternative, but it is a possibility.
Mr. Secretary, I think the wisdom contained in your remarks earlier and your careful reason instills enormous confidence in Americans in our foreign policy, and we certainly wish you the very, very best in the discharge of those responsibilities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure.